Layla Carter, a strong, determined high school student with a quiet resilience. But her world shifts when Officer Phelps, the school's new security officer, starts keeping a close, suspicious watch on her every move. As the weeks go on, what begins as a routine hallway encounter grows into an unspoken conflict, testing Layla's patience and inner strength. Supported by her loyal friends, a compassionate principal, and her father's wisdom, Layla stands her ground in the face of unfair scrutiny, showing us the power of resilience in the face of adversity. What do you think Layla will do next? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you can be part of the journey with us. Now let's dive into Layla's story. The bell rang, echoing through the tall, arched hallways of Washington High School. Streams of students flowed through the corridors, filling the air with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and the clanging of lockers. It was just another day for most of them, and the morning sun filtering through the old windows cast a warm glow across the bustling hallway. Amid the familiar faces, one figure moved with quiet confidence, a calm, steady presence among the teenage energy. Layla Carter adjusted her backpack as she navigated through the crowd. She was slender and tall, with a natural poise that made her seem both unassuming and somehow distinct. Her gaze was soft yet focused, revealing a thoughtful depth beyond her 17 years. For most, she was just another junior at Washington High, but Layla held a quiet determination that set her apart, though she preferred to keep her head down. She made her way to her locker and smiled briefly as she opened it, glancing at a small slip of paper taped to the inside of the door. In her father's familiar handwriting were the words, "Stay strong, Layla. I'm proud of you." It was a note Captain William Carter had written to her at the start of the school year, a small piece of home in the bustling, often chaotic world of high school. She read it daily, a reminder of her father's unwavering support and the values he'd instilled in her. Captain Carter was respected throughout the city. With years of dedicated service as the police captain, he had built a reputation for fairness and integrity. Layla admired her father deeply, though she'd long decided to keep his status private at school. She didn't want to be known as the police captain's daughter or feel pressured to live up to anyone's expectations. Independence meant everything to her, and she valued the freedom to shape her own identity. As she organized her books for her first class, she sensed a change in the hallway's atmosphere. It was subtle at first. Some students grew quieter, their glances shifting toward the front entrance. Layla's curiosity piqued, and she glanced over her shoulder, following their gaze. Standing by the entrance, looking out over the students with a fixed, intense expression, was a police officer Layla hadn't seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a clean-shaven face and a posture that spoke of years in uniform. There was an air of strictness around him, as if his very presence demanded order. Even from a distance, Layla could feel his gaze, sweeping over the students with an almost clinical scrutiny. The officer's brow furrowed slightly as he watched the passing students, and Layla could see his jaw tighten. She turned back to her locker, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled over her. The officer's gaze wasn't on her specifically, but something about him gave her an uneasy sense. It reminded her of conversations with her father about authority, justice, and how respect could sometimes be a one-way street with certain people in uniform. She had learned that while many officers wore their badges with honor, some seemed more interested in wielding authority than protecting the community. Layla closed her locker and blended into the crowd, heading toward her first class, willing herself to focus on her day. She wasn't going to let the presence of an officer disrupt her routine, but a flicker of unease remained. The next morning, as students filed through the entrance, Layla noticed the officer stationed in the same place, his expression as unreadable as before. She'd learned his name was Officer Luke Phelps, a former military man reassigned to school patrol duty under new security measures. Although the staff had explained that his presence was routine, meant to provide an added layer of safety, Officer Phelps seemed anything but a comforting presence. She walked past him, her gaze straightforward but calm, as her father had taught her. Despite her neutral expression, she could sense his eyes on her, almost as if he were studying her. The uncomfortable awareness prickled at the back of her neck, but she kept her stride steady and unhurried. "Miss," his voice called out, low and steady. Layla stopped, surprised. Turning, she saw Phelps watching her with narrowed eyes, arms crossed over his chest. His posture exuded authority, and his gaze was sharp, scrutinizing her as though he were trying to see through her. "Yes, officer," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. Her father's words rang in her mind. Always stay calm, respectful, and assertive. It was a lesson she'd grown up with, a mix of his professional wisdom and his understanding of what it meant to navigate the world as a young black woman. "Where are you headed this morning?" he asked, his tone almost casual but laced with an edge she couldn't ignore. "To my first class," Layla replied, keeping her voice even. "It starts in a few minutes." Phelps nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her as if searching for something in her face. "And what's in the backpack?" he asked, gesturing slightly toward her shoulder. Caught off guard, Layla hesitated, then replied, "My books and personal items." She kept her tone steady, trying not to show her surprise at the abrupt question. She had heard about random searches in other schools, but it seemed out of place here, especially when she was just on her way to class like everyone else. Phelps' eyes narrowed. "I'm going to need to check that bag," he said, his voice dropping slightly, the hint of a challenge in his tone. Layla felt a surge of discomfort, but nodded slowly, keeping her voice respectful. "Is there a reason for the search, Officer Phelps?" His jaw tightened. "Just following protocol, making sure no one's bringing anything they shouldn't." Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. There was no need to cause a scene. Silently, she slipped her bag from her shoulder and held it out, watching as he opened it and sifted through her belongings with a deliberate slowness. His hands moved over her books, notebooks, and personal items, his expression unchanged as he inspected each item. Layla could feel the eyes of other students on her, and her cheeks burned with the humiliation of being singled out. At last, Phelps finished his inspection and handed the bag back to her without a word. She slung it over her shoulder, meeting his gaze calmly. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. He didn't reply, only nodded slightly, his eyes still narrowed as if he hadn't quite decided what to make of her. Layla turned and walked toward her class, resisting the urge to glance back over her shoulder. Her mind was a mix of frustration and confusion. She had done nothing wrong, yet he had treated her as if she were a potential threat. As she walked into her classroom, the sting of humiliation lingered. She took her seat, feeling her classmates' glances on her, some curious, others sympathetic. She took a deep breath, grounding herself in her father's words, finding strength in the values he'd instilled in her. At lunch, Layla found a quiet corner in the cafeteria with her two closest friends, Mariah Ellis and Jason Reed. Mariah was her confidant, warm and full of energy, and Jason was calm and thoughtful, often the voice of reason between them. They had known each other since middle school and had always been each other's pillars of support. "So, what was that about?" Mariah asked, raising an eyebrow. "I saw Phelps stop you this morning. Looked like he was giving you the third degree." Jason shook his head, his brow furrowing. "I heard he's ex-military, and apparently he's supposed to be here for extra security. But I don't know, he doesn't exactly make anyone feel safe." Layla shrugged, trying to downplay the tension she felt. "I don't know. Maybe he's just doing his job." Mariah's expression softened, though her eyes remained sharp. "Just be careful. He gives off some serious intimidation vibes." "Yeah, I will," Layla replied, grateful for their support. She could tell they were both concerned, but she didn't want to worry them more than necessary. This was her burden to bear, and she was determined to handle it on her own. The next day, Layla entered Washington High's main hallway, her mind on her English paper. She planned to head straight to her locker, but the sight of Officer Phelps stationed in his usual place, near the front entrance, brought her back to a familiar tension. He was watching her again, his gaze fixed and calculating, like he was waiting for her to make a mistake. Layla kept her stride steady, ignoring the urge to speed up or look down. She held her backpack close to her shoulder, focusing on the sound of her footsteps and the voices around her. Just as she reached her locker, however, Phelps moved, crossing the hallway to intercept her. "Morning, Miss Carter," he said, his tone firm. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowed as he gestured toward her bag. Let's take another look inside. Layla's heart skipped a beat. Her hands tightened on the strap of her backpack, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. Is something wrong, Officer Phelps? It's just a routine check, he replied, his voice sharp. Making sure everyone here is safe. Layla knew she hadn't done anything to warrant this, but she also knew better than to argue. Keeping her voice calm, she handed over her backpack, glancing around as he unzipped it. A few other students slowed their pace, watching with curiosity, but no one said anything. As he went through her belongings again, Layla felt her face flush with embarrassment. There was nothing incriminating in her bag, only her notebooks, pencil case, and a few other personal items. But the way Phelps handled each item, inspecting everything as though he were searching for something dangerous, made her feel as though she were under a spotlight. Finally, he handed the backpack back to her. All right, he said, his voice laced with suspicion. You can go. Thank you, Layla replied softly, her voice betraying none of the frustration building inside her. Without another word, she walked to her locker, ignoring the quiet glances that followed her. She could still feel the weight of Phelps' scrutiny, lingering like a shadow, and it left a hollow feeling in her chest. She tried to push it aside as she gathered her books, but the sensation of being unfairly judged stayed with her all morning. By lunchtime, word had spread that Officer Phelps had stopped Layla twice in 2 days. She could feel the whispers as she walked through the hallways. Some students cast curious glances her way, while others whispered to each other in low voices. A few even gave her sidelong looks of pity or confusion. It felt strange, unsettling. Layla had always tried to keep a low profile at school, preferring to focus on her studies and her friendships rather than drawing attention to herself. Now, it seemed as though she had become the topic of every whispered conversation, and she could feel herself growing tense under the weight of the attention. She found her usual table in the cafeteria, and Mariah and Jason joined her shortly after. What was that about this morning? Mariah asked, lowering her voice. Is he seriously stopping you every day now? Layla sighed, pushing a piece of bread around her tray. I don't know, Mariah. It's like he thinks I'm doing something wrong just by being here. Jason leaned forward, his face thoughtful. That doesn't make any sense. You're one of the top students here. He's targeting the wrong person if he's looking for trouble. Tell him that, Layla replied with a small, humorless laugh. Mariah shook her head, her eyes flashing with anger. Honestly, this whole thing just feels wrong. It's not fair, Layla. You don't deserve this. Layla forced a smile, trying to hide the unease that had settled deep in her stomach. I'm fine. It's just frustrating, I guess. She appreciated Mariah and Jason's support, but part of her didn't want them to worry. This was something she'd have to face on her own, and she wasn't going to let it weigh her down. That evening, as Layla sat at the kitchen table with her homework spread out in front of her, she glanced at the clock and noted that her father would be home soon. She'd been debating whether to tell him about Officer Phelps, unsure if she wanted him to worry, but as the minutes ticked by, she found herself longing for his advice. Captain William Carter arrived home shortly after, his face lighting up with a warm smile when he saw her. He set his briefcase down and joined her at the table. How was school today? He asked, pouring himself a glass of water. Layla hesitated, twirling her pen between her fingers. It was okay. Mostly. Captain Carter's smile faded as he noticed her expression. He studied her carefully, his face growing serious. What's going on, Layla? She took a deep breath, finally deciding to tell him about Officer Phelps and the repeated bag checks. She kept her tone steady, recounting the events in as much detail as possible. Captain Carter listened intently, his expression thoughtful and unreadable. When she finished, he set his glass down, his brow furrowing slightly. That sounds strange. Did he give you any reason for the searches? Not really, Layla replied, shaking her head. He just said it was a routine check, but it felt personal, like he was waiting for me to do something wrong. Captain Carter sat back, folding his hands on the table. Some people take authority as a license to scrutinize others, especially if they don't know or understand them. But that doesn't mean you have to tolerate it. What should I do? She asked, her voice quiet. Her father's gaze softened, and he reached across the table to place a reassuring hand over hers. You stand your ground, Layla. Keep your head high, stay respectful, and don't let him intimidate you. If he continues this without reason, you let me know, and we'll take it from there. But remember, the way you handle this will speak volumes about your character. Layla nodded, feeling a surge of relief mixed with newfound determination. Her father's support meant the world to her, and his words gave her the strength to face whatever might come next. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. Thanks, Dad, she murmured. I'll handle it. He smiled, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. I know you will. The next day, Layla entered the school with a sense of renewed strength, her father's words echoing in her mind. She held her head high, determined not to let Phelps's scrutiny affect her. But as she walked toward her first class, she spotted him standing at the far end of the hallway, watching her intently. Phelps made his way over, and Layla braced herself, preparing for another interrogation. Miss Carter, he said, his tone sharper than before. I'd like a word. She stopped, meeting his gaze with calm resolve. Yes, officer? He crossed his arms, his posture rigid. I don't appreciate the attitude you've been giving me. You may think you're clever, but I see through that calm act. You can't hide from me. Layla's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay composed. I'm just here to get to class, Officer Phelps. I haven't done anything wrong. Her calm tone seemed to infuriate him. His eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. I'm watching you, Miss Carter. Don't think you can get away with anything. A few students had gathered nearby, casting uneasy glances at the scene unfolding before them. Layla felt her cheeks flush under the weight of their stares, but she refused to back down. I understand, Officer Phelps, she replied, her voice steady. But I would appreciate being treated with respect, just like any other student here. For a brief moment, he looked taken aback, as if he hadn't expected her to speak up. His jaw tightened, and he seemed to struggle with his response. But just as he opened his mouth to say something, a voice interrupted them. Is there a problem here? Layla turned to see Principal Avery approaching, her expression calm but firm. The principal's gaze shifted between Layla and Phelps, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the tension between them. Phelps straightened, his face flushing slightly. Just a routine check, Principal Avery. Principal Avery nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on him. I see. Well, I think it's best if we continue our routine checks without singling anyone out. Miss Carter, you're free to go to class. Layla gave the principal a grateful nod and walked away, her heart pounding. She felt the tension ease as she moved down the hallway, the weight of the encounter lifting from her shoulders. She had stood her ground, and Principal Avery's support had only strengthened her resolve. But as she walked to her next class, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Officer Phelps had made it clear he wouldn't back down, and she knew she'd have to be ready for whatever he might try next. Over the next few days, the weight of Phelps's attention grew more oppressive. Every time Layla walked through the hallways, she felt his eyes on her. He didn't always approach her, but his presence lingered like a shadow following her from one class to the next. The whispers among her classmates hadn't died down either. It seemed that her interactions with Phelps had become a regular topic of discussion. Some students offered quiet smiles of support, but most simply observed her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She found herself eating lunch more often with Mariah and Jason in quiet corners, where she could try to forget the watchful stares. Mariah's kindness helped her feel a little more grounded, but there was a tension she couldn't shake, a sense of isolation that was growing, even among her friends. One day during lunch, Mariah gave her a concerned look. Have you thought about talking to Principal Avery again? Maybe she can help you get this guy to back off. Layla sighed, poking at her salad. She already stepped in once. I don't know how much more she can do. Phelps isn't exactly breaking any rules. He's just making things difficult. Jason leaned in, his eyes thoughtful. Still, this isn't right, Layla. It's like he's waiting for you to slip up. You shouldn't have to feel like this just for going to school. Layla forced a small smile. Thanks, guys. I appreciate you both. Really. I don't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he's getting to me. Mariah reached across the table, giving her hand a supportive squeeze. We're here for you, no matter what. The comfort of her friends was a welcome relief. But as Layla headed to her next class, she could feel the tension settling back over her. It was like a weight she carried, one she couldn't simply shrug off. The following week, things took a turn. It was Tuesday morning, and Layla was on her way to her second period class when she heard Officer Phelps call her name from down the hallway. She stopped, closing her eyes briefly to gather her composure before turning to face him. He approached with his usual hard expression, eyes narrowed. "Miss Carter, come with me." A wave of apprehension swept over her. "Is there a problem, Officer Phelps?" He gestured to her backpack. "Another routine check. Just want to make sure everything is in order." Layla's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She handed him her bag, watching as he opened it and began sifting through her belongings. This time, though, he seemed to be even more thorough, taking his time as he examined each item. A few students had gathered nearby, their whispers barely audible, but Layla could feel their eyes on her. She fought back a surge of frustration, trying to maintain her composure. Phelps paused, holding up a small notebook. "What's this?" he asked, his tone challenging. "It's just a notebook," she replied evenly. "My English notes." He flipped through the pages, scrutinizing the handwritten notes as though expecting to find something incriminating. After a moment, he snapped the notebook shut and continued rummaging through her bag. The whole ordeal felt unnecessary, a public display meant to rattle her, and it was working. Finally, he handed the bag back to her, his expression unreadable. "All right, you can go," he said, his tone cold. Layla took her backpack, her face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. "Thank you, Officer Phelps," she replied quietly, not wanting to give him any reason to escalate further. As she walked away, she could hear the low murmur of her classmates. The sting of embarrassment clung to her as she made her way to her next class, her mind racing with frustration. She'd never felt so unfairly targeted, so exposed. But she knew she couldn't let him see that he was getting to her. Later that week, Layla found herself in Mr. Walsh's history class, trying to focus on the lesson. Mr. Walsh was one of her favorite teachers, a kind, attentive presence who made his classroom feel like a safe haven. Today, though, she was distracted, her mind weighed down by the repeated confrontations with Phelps. As the class wrapped up, Mr. Walsh asked her to stay behind. He waited until the other students had left, then gestured for her to take a seat. "I wanted to check in with you," he said gently, his gaze warm and concerned. "You seem a bit preoccupied lately. Is everything all right?" Layla hesitated, unsure how much to say. She didn't want to make a big deal out of things, but the concern in Mr. Walsh's eyes encouraged her to speak. "It's just Officer Phelps. He's been watching me, stopping me in the hallways, checking my bag." Mr. Walsh nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. "I've noticed some of that. It seems unnecessary, to say the least." Layla's shoulders relaxed slightly. Just hearing him acknowledge the unfairness of it lifted some of the weight from her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I didn't want to make it a big deal, but it's been difficult." He gave her a reassuring smile. "Layla, you're one of the most diligent students I've had. If you need any support, please don't hesitate to reach out. You don't have to go through this alone." Grateful for his understanding, Layla nodded, feeling a renewed sense of strength. Knowing that she had allies, even if she didn't want to rely on them, gave her the courage to keep going. The next Monday, Layla was on her way to her afternoon class when she realized her bracelet, a simple silver band her grandmother had given her, was missing. She'd had it with her that morning, and panic gripped her as she retraced her steps, looking through her backpack and her locker. But it was nowhere to be found. Her heart sank. The bracelet was one of the few things she had left from her grandmother, and the thought of it being lost felt like a punch to the gut. During her search, she spotted Officer Phelps standing by the entrance, his gaze sharp and intense. He held something small in his hand, and as she drew closer, she realized it was her bracelet. Relief mixed with a strange sense of dread as she approached him. "That's mine," she said, reaching for it. Phelps held it just out of reach, his expression unreadable. "I found it in a restricted area, the boys' locker room." Layla's face flushed with confusion. "That can't be right. I never went near there." He raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Is that so? Because I found it there. Perhaps you'd like to explain how it got there. The implication stung, and she struggled to find the right words. I don't know how it got there, but I didn't go anywhere near the locker room. Phelps regarded her with a cold, challenging look. We'll see. I'll be speaking to the principal about this. Make sure your story doesn't change. He handed the bracelet back, and as he walked away, Layla felt a deep sense of frustration and helplessness. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but she also knew that proving her innocence would be difficult. After the incident with the bracelet, Layla went to Principal Avery's office, determined to explain her side of the story. She recounted the strange series of confrontations with Phelps, her growing discomfort, and the unfairness of his scrutiny. Principal Avery listened carefully, her face thoughtful as she considered Layla's words. I understand, Layla. I've observed some of Officer Phelps's interactions with you, and I agree they seem out of place. Layla felt a wave of relief wash over her. Thank you, Principal Avery. I feel like he's waiting for me to mess up, like he's targeting me. Principal Avery nodded, her expression sympathetic. I'll look into it. In the meantime, continue to hold yourself to the standard you always have, Layla. You're a respectful student, and I trust your word. Layla left the principal's office feeling reassured, but a part of her couldn't shake the worry that Phelps wouldn't stop. Still, knowing that someone in authority believed her gave her the strength to keep going. A few days later, Layla was walking down the hallway between classes when she spotted Phelps waiting near the lockers. Her stomach tightened as he strode toward her, his face set in a hard expression. Miss Carter, he said, his voice low and edged with irritation. I need a word with you. Now. The command drew the attention of nearby students who paused to watch. Layla straightened, reminding herself of her father's words. She met Phelps's gaze, her voice calm but firm. Yes, Officer Phelps? He crossed his arms, leaning in slightly as if to impose his authority. I don't like your attitude. You're walking around this school like you own the place, challenging my authority at every turn. Layla took a deep breath, resisting the urge to react emotionally. With all due respect, Officer Phelps, I've only been respectful to you. I'm here to learn, like every other student. Phelps's eyes narrowed, his face darkening. Watch yourself, Miss Carter. You may think you're clever, but I see right through that calm act of yours. The tension hung heavy in the air, and the students around them seemed to hold their breath. Just as Phelps opened his mouth to continue, a familiar voice cut through the silence. Is there a problem here? Principal Avery's calm, steady voice filled the hallway, and Phelps's face flushed as he turned to face her. Layla felt a surge of relief as the principal stepped forward, her gaze firm and unyielding. No problem, Principal Avery, Phelps said, his tone tight. He cast Layla a final, lingering look before stepping back, allowing her to continue to her class. Principal Avery turned to Layla, offering a slight nod of encouragement. You're free to go, Layla. Have a good day. Layla gave her a grateful smile, her heart still pounding. She walked to class, feeling the weight of Phelps's scrutiny lift, at least for the moment. But as she took her seat, she knew this was only the beginning. The conflict had reached a boiling point, and she would need all her strength to face whatever came next. The days following the confrontation in the hallway left Layla tense, but she felt a growing resolve. Students who had witnessed the interaction with Phelps began to show subtle signs of solidarity. A few nodded respectfully as she walked by, and others offered supportive glances when Phelps wasn't watching. Mariah and Jason continued to stick close to her during lunch and between classes, creating a sense of calm that helped her feel less isolated. One afternoon, as they sat at their usual spot in the cafeteria, Mariah spoke up, her voice laced with frustration. I don't know what Phelps thinks he's doing, but it's not okay, she said, frowning. He's singling you out, Layla. Everyone can see it. Jason nodded in agreement, his gaze serious. If he keeps this up, maybe you should talk to someone higher up. This has to have some kind of limit. Layla took a deep breath, grateful for their support. Principal Avery already knows. She's been really understanding, but I don't know how much she can do. I don't want to make this worse. Mariah leaned in, her expression fierce. You're not making it worse by standing up for yourself. He's the one pushing you, and you don't deserve that. None of us do. A wave of appreciation washed over Layla. Her friend's support was like a shield, strengthening her and helping her bear the weight of Phelps's scrutiny. It reminded her that she wasn't alone, that there were people around her who saw her struggle and believed in her. Layla found herself drawing strength from her father's words as well. Every evening, she replayed his advice in her mind. Stay respectful, hold your ground, and don't let anyone make you feel small. She clung to those words, allowing them to guide her through each encounter with Phelps. One afternoon, she returned home to find her father sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through some paperwork. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, setting his work aside. "Hey, Layla, how was school today?" he asked, his tone warm but attentive. She shrugged, managing a small smile. "It was okay. Phelps is still around." Captain Carter's expression tightened slightly, but he nodded, respecting her need to handle things on her own. "Remember, Layla, your strength isn't in reacting to him. It's in holding yourself with dignity, no matter how he treats you. I'm here if you ever need anything more." The reassurance in his voice filled her with gratitude. She knew her father would always have her back, but his trust in her ability to face Phelps on her own gave her confidence. It was a reminder that she had the strength within herself to handle this, and she was determined to prove that strength each day. The following Friday, Layla experienced another incident that left her shaken. She was headed to her last class when she realized that her English textbook was missing. Confused, she returned to her locker, checking the shelves in her backpack, but it was nowhere to be found. She felt a pang of frustration, her mind racing with the possibility that she'd simply left it somewhere. But as she walked back through the hallway, scanning her memory, she noticed Phelps standing by the front office. And in his hand, he was holding her English textbook. Layla approached slowly, her heart sinking as he raised an eyebrow and held the book out in her direction. "Looking for this?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock concern. "Yes, that's mine," Layla replied, reaching for it. But Phelps held on to it for a moment longer, his gaze hard. "Funny thing, I found it in the boys' locker room." Layla's eyes widened in shock. "What? That can't be right. I never went near there." Phelps studied her, his smirk almost taunting. "I wonder what the principal would think of that." She felt a flare of anger, but forced herself to stay calm. "I honestly don't know how it got there, Officer Phelps. I didn't put it there." He shrugged, handing the book back to her. "I'll take your word for it this time, but I'll be keeping an eye on you, Miss Carter." Layla took the book, fighting the urge to say something more. She knew better than to let her emotions get the best of her, but as she walked away, the frustration simmered beneath the surface. She could feel the unfairness of the situation like a weight pressing down on her, but she refused to let Phelps see her falter. That afternoon, Layla found herself once again in Principal Avery's office. She recounted the strange events surrounding her missing textbook and Phelps's accusation, her voice steady but laced with a quiet frustration. Principal Avery listened with an empathetic expression, nodding thoughtfully as Layla finished. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Layla," she said. "I've observed some of these interactions myself, and I agree that Officer Phelps's behavior seems unusual." Layla felt a surge of relief at her words. "Thank you, Principal Avery. I don't want to feel like I'm being treated unfairly just for coming to school." Principal Avery's expression softened. "I understand, and I'll be speaking with Officer Phelps about this. In the meantime, please know that I believe you, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you feel safe here." Layla left the office feeling a mix of relief and determination. She knew she was standing on solid ground, and as long as she held on to that truth, she would be able to face Phelps's scrutiny with courage. The following week, the atmosphere at Washington High seemed to shift. News of Phelps's latest confrontation with Layla had spread, and many students had begun to openly show support. She noticed a few more sympathetic nods in the hallways, small gestures that reminded her she wasn't as isolated as she sometimes felt. Mariah and Jason continued to stand by her side, and Mr. Walsh even made a point of offering her encouragement during class. "You're doing great, Layla," he said one afternoon as she handed in an assignment. "Don't let anyone make you doubt that." The subtle but constant support from her friends and teachers made a world of difference, helping her to feel less alone and more empowered. She had a community around her, people who saw her strength and believed in her, and that knowledge filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, as she walked past Phelps in the hallway, she met his gaze head-on, refusing to look away. He gave her a hard stare, but she held her ground, her expression calm and unwavering. It was a silent standoff, a quiet act of defiance, and she could see the faint flicker of frustration in his eyes. Without a word, she walked away, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back. But this time, instead of feeling small, she felt strong. She was determined to face him with dignity, no matter how many times he tried to break her resolve. As the days went by, Layla continued to handle Phelps's scrutiny with quiet strength. But one morning, just before her first class, he approached her in the crowded hallway, his expression set in a cold glare. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby students. "We need to have a talk." Layla stopped, meeting his gaze calmly. "Yes, Officer Phelps?" His eyes narrowed. "I don't appreciate the way you've been behaving around here. Acting like you're untouchable, like the rules don't apply to you." Layla felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stay composed. "I'm just here to go to class, Officer Phelps. I haven't done anything wrong." His face flushed slightly, a mixture of frustration and anger darkening his expression. "That's not what I'm seeing. You think you're clever, don't you? Acting like you're above authority." The nearby students were silent, watching the exchange with wide eyes. Layla could feel the tension in the air, the weight of their gazes, but she refused to back down. Taking a deep breath, she looked him squarely in the eyes. "With all due respect, Officer Phelps, I'm just here to learn. I'm not trying to cause any problems." For a moment, he looked taken aback, as if he hadn't expected her to stand her ground. But his expression quickly hardened, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Watch yourself, Miss Carter. You may think you're untouchable, but I'm watching every move you make." The threat in his words sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to let him see her fear. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, a familiar voice interrupted. "Is there a problem here, Officer Phelps?" Principal Avery stepped forward, her calm, steady presence filling the hallway. She looked between Phelps and Layla, her expression a mix of authority and quiet strength. Phelps straightened, his face flushing slightly. "No problem, Principal Avery," he replied, his tone forced. Principal Avery's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned to Layla. "You're free to go to class, Layla." Layla nodded, grateful for the principal's intervention. She walked away, her heart racing, but a feeling of quiet triumph settling over her. She had stood her ground, refusing to let Phelps's intimidation define her. As she walked down the hallway, she felt a surge of pride. The support of her friends, her teachers, and her father gave her the strength to face Phelps with courage, and she knew that, no matter what came next, she wouldn't back down. After her latest encounter with Phelps, Layla noticed a change in the atmosphere at Washington High. News of their confrontation had spread, and the students seemed more aware of the unfair treatment she was facing. Mariah and Jason were quick to voice their outrage, and even students she didn't know well offered subtle nods or words of encouragement as she passed by. One afternoon, she was on her way to her locker when she overheard two students in her grade, Hannah and Ryan, talking quietly nearby. "Honestly, I think she's handling it better than I would," Ryan muttered. "I'd be furious if someone was watching me like that every day." Hannah nodded. "Right? It's so wrong. But she just deals with it. She doesn't even make a scene. I don't know how she does it." Layla paused for a moment, a mixture of gratitude and sadness settling in her chest. She hadn't chosen to become the focus of everyone's attention, but their support reminded her that she wasn't completely alone. The weight of Phelps's scrutiny was still heavy, but knowing that others saw the injustice helped her to feel a little stronger. The following Monday, as Layla sat through her English class, she found it hard to concentrate. Phelps's constant surveillance was taking a toll on her focus, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep her mind on her work. She glanced at the clock, willing the minutes to pass so she could retreat to her next class. When the bell finally rang, she gathered her things and made her way down the hallway, only to spot Phelps waiting near the door to the cafeteria. He watched her with that same unyielding gaze, arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to walk past him without showing any hesitation. But as she did, he called out, stopping her in her tracks. "Miss Carter, a word," he said, his voice carrying over the noise of the bustling hallway. Layla turned to face him, her expression calm. "Yes, Officer Phelps." He regarded her for a moment, his eyes sharp. "You seem to be having a lot of conversations around here lately. A bit of advice. Watch who you're talking to. I wouldn't want you to get the wrong kind of attention." She felt her stomach tighten, but she met his gaze without blinking. "I'm just talking to my friends, Officer Phelps. I don't think that should be a problem." His jaw clenched, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more. But he only gave her a cold, thin-lipped smile. "Just remember what I said, Miss Carter." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. She could feel the eyes of a few nearby students on her, but she ignored them, her hands clenched tightly around her back. She took a steadying breath and reminded herself that she had the strength to face this, no matter how relentless he seemed. That evening, Layla sat with her father in the living room, the soft hum of the television filling the background. She'd been quiet since coming home, and Captain Carter had noticed. "Layla," he said gently, setting down his glass of water. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated, glancing down at her hands. She hadn't wanted to burden him with more of the details about Phelps, but the weight of the past few days felt heavy on her shoulders. "It's just Phelps," she said quietly. "He's still watching me, and it's getting harder to ignore." Her father's expression softened, and he reached out, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "I understand, and I know how hard this is. But remember, Layla, your strength lies in staying calm and not giving him the reaction he wants. You're stronger than any pressure he's putting on you." She nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I'm trying, Dad. I really am." He smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. "You're doing more than trying. You're standing up for yourself in a way that most people wouldn't. And that's something to be proud of." Layla took a deep breath, feeling her resolve strengthen. Her father's words reminded her that she was capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. And no matter how difficult things became, she knew she had his unwavering support. The next day at school, Layla's confidence felt renewed. She walked through the hallways with her head held high, refusing to let Phelps's presence weigh her down. She reminded herself of her father's words, of the quiet strength she carried within herself. As she made her way to her first class, she noticed Mr. Walsh standing outside his classroom, greeting students as they walked in. He gave her a warm smile, nodding in quiet support. "Good morning, Layla." "Good morning, Mr. Walsh," she replied, feeling a small surge of comfort in his presence. Throughout the day, she held on to that sense of strength, allowing herself to feel proud of her resilience. Phelps was still there, still watching, but she focused on the things that grounded her, her friends, her teachers, and the support she knew she had at home. By the time the final bell rang, she felt a sense of victory. It wasn't a grand moment, but in her heart, she knew she had won a small battle. She had faced Phelps's scrutiny without letting it shake her, and that gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in a long time. The following week, Phelps's scrutiny seemed to intensify. He was stationed near her classes more often, his gaze following her every move. It felt as though he was waiting for any excuse to call her out, to catch her in the slightest mistake. One afternoon, as she was leaving her history class, she saw him standing by the lockers, his expression unreadable. She did her best to ignore him, but as she walked past, he stepped into her path, blocking her way. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone edged with a faint hint of impatience. "I need to speak with you." Layla felt a flicker of frustration, but she met his gaze with calm determination. "Yes, Officer Phelps?" He crossed his arms, studying her for a moment. "You seem to be getting a lot of attention these days. A bit of advice, try to keep a low profile." The words stung, but she refused to let him see her reaction. "I'm just here to go to class, Officer Phelps. I don't think that's against any rules." A muscle in his jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Just remember what I said, Miss Carter." With that, he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. As she walked away, she felt the weight of his gaze, but she refused to let it affect her. She was determined to remain strong, no matter how many times he tried to test her. Later that week, Layla found herself in the school library, working on a history project. She loved the quiet calm of the library, the way it allowed her to focus without distraction. But as she looked up, she saw Phelps standing by the entrance, watching her with that same unyielding gaze. Ignoring him, she returned her attention to her project, refusing to let his presence distract her. She focused on her work, her mind steady and clear, even as she felt his eyes on her. It was a small but powerful act of defiance, a reminder to herself that she was in control. When she finally gathered her things and left, she walked past him without a second glance. She could feel the weight of his presence, but she didn't let it touch her. In that moment, she knew that her strength was her own, and no one, not even Phelps, could take that away. The following Monday, Layla was on her way to her last class of the day when she spotted Phelps waiting near the entrance to the gym. She felt a pang of apprehension but took a deep breath, reminding herself of her father's words. She held her head high, determined to stay calm no matter what he said. As she approached, Phelps stepped directly into her path, his face set in a cold, hard expression. "Miss Carter, I'd like to have a word." The command drew the attention of nearby students, who stopped to watch. Layla could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her gaze focused on Phelps, her expression calm and unyielding. "Yes, Officer Phelps?" she asked, her voice steady. His eyes narrowed. "I don't like the attitude you've been showing around here. You think you could just walk around this school like you own the place, challenging my authority." Layla felt a surge of anger, but forced herself to stay composed. "With all due respect, Officer Phelps, I'm here to go to class and to learn, just like everyone else." Phelps's face flushed slightly, a mixture of frustration and anger in his eyes. "Watch yourself, Miss Carter. People like you always slip up sooner or later." The tension in the hallway grew thick, the students around them silent, waiting to see how she would respond. But instead of reacting, Layla took a deep breath and looked him in the eyes. "With all due respect, Officer Phelps," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I don't think I deserve this kind of treatment. I'm just trying to be a good student, and I'd appreciate being treated with respect." For a moment, he looked taken aback, as though he hadn't expected her to stand her ground. His expression hardened, but just as he opened his mouth to respond, Principal Avery appeared. "Is there an issue here?" she asked, her gaze moving between them. Phelps straightened, his face flushing. "No, Principal Avery. Just a routine check." Principal Avery looked between them, her expression unreadable. "Layla, you're free to go to your class." Layla nodded, grateful for the principal's support. She walked away, her heart racing, but with a sense of quiet victory filling her chest. She had stood her ground, refusing to let Phelps see her falter. As she entered her next class, she knew that this confrontation had reached a turning point. She had faced Phelps with strength and dignity, and no matter what came next, she knew she could handle it. The following week, Layla noticed more and more students showing their support. The tension surrounding her and Officer Phelps was palpable, and it seemed her classmates were beginning to realize the gravity of her situation. A few even started offering small words of encouragement in the halls, quietly expressing their solidarity. One day, as she was heading to her locker after lunch, she ran into Sarah Moore, a classmate she didn't know well. Sarah smiled, an encouraging look in her eyes. "Hey, Layla," she said softly. "I just wanted to say, I think you're really brave." Layla blinked in surprise, her heart warming at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot." Sarah nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "If you ever need anything, I'm here. We all are." Layla felt a surge of gratitude, and for the first time, she realized how much strength she drew from her peers. The quiet support from classmates like Sarah made her feel less alone and reminded her that she had allies, even in small, subtle ways. She wasn't facing this challenge by herself, and knowing that gave her a renewed sense of courage. That weekend, Layla spent time with her family, taking a break from the stress of school. She joined her father on the back porch, the soft autumn breeze rustling the leaves around them as they sipped their drinks in comfortable silence. Captain Carter glanced at her, a gentle look in his eyes. You've been handling things well, Layla. I can see that you're taking everything in stride, even if it's not easy. She managed a small smile. I'm trying, Dad. It's been a lot. He nodded, setting his cup down. I know it hasn't been fair, but I want you to remember that what you're doing takes courage. You're standing up for yourself, showing respect, and keeping your dignity. That's a rare strength. Layla felt a swell of emotion as she looked at her father, his words filling her with a quiet pride. Thanks, Dad. I just needed to hear that. He reached over, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Anytime. Just remember, Layla, you're stronger than you think. The warmth and support she felt in that moment lifted a weight from her shoulders. She felt more prepared to face whatever lay ahead, knowing her family was there to back her up. The following week at school, Phelps seemed more determined than ever to keep Layla in his sights. She couldn't walk through a hallway or sit in a classroom without feeling his presence nearby, his gaze cold and unyielding. It was as though he were waiting for her to slip up, ready to pounce at the smallest opportunity. One afternoon, as she was leaving her last class, she caught sight of him standing by the doors. She kept her head up, her steps steady, but just as she passed by, he moved to intercept her. Miss Carter, he said, his tone sharp. I'd like to have a word. Layla paused, schooling her expression to remain neutral. Yes, Officer Phelps? He folded his arms, his gaze intense. I don't appreciate the way you've been carrying yourself lately. You're drawing too much attention. That's the kind of behavior that gets people into trouble. The implication stung, but Layla met his gaze without flinching. With all due respect, Officer, I'm just here to go to school. I haven't done anything wrong. Phelps's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. That may be, but don't think for a second that I'm going to let you out of my sight. You're on thin ice, Miss Carter. Layla took a steadying breath, choosing her words carefully. I understand, Officer Phelps. I'd just like to be treated with the same respect as every other student. He seemed momentarily taken aback by her calm response, but he quickly recovered, his face darkening. Remember what I said, Miss Carter. I'll be watching. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. She felt a knot of frustration twist in her chest, but she pushed it aside, refusing to let him see her rattled. She would face him with strength and dignity, no matter how relentless he became. Word of the latest confrontation with Phelps spread quickly, and by the following day, several students had started openly showing their support. In one of her classes, a few students made a point to sit near Layla, offering her silent but reassuring smiles. Mariah and Jason remained by her side, their presence a constant source of comfort. Jason had even taken to walking with her between classes, standing a little taller whenever they passed Phelps in the hallway. Honestly, I don't know how you do it, Layla, he said one day as they headed to their lockers. He's relentless, but you're handling this like a pro. Layla managed a small smile, feeling a surge of gratitude for her friends. Thanks, Jason. I couldn't do it without you and Mariah. Mariah gave her a gentle nudge, grinning. You're the one doing all the work, girl. We're just here to make sure you know you've got people backing you up. Their support was like a lifeline, grounding her and giving her the strength to face each new day. Layla knew she was lucky to have friends like Mariah and Jason, and their loyalty helped her stand firm, even when things seemed toughest. Later that week, Mr. Walsh pulled Layla aside after history class. His face held a look of quiet encouragement, and he gestured for her to sit. I just wanted to tell you, Layla, that I'm impressed with the way you've been handling things, he said gently. I know this situation with Officer Phelps hasn't been easy, but you've shown remarkable resilience. Layla felt a rush of gratitude, her eyes stinging slightly. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. It's been difficult, but I'm trying to stay strong. He nodded, a proud smile touching his face. And you're doing a fine job of it. Remember, you're not alone in this. The students, your friends, and the staff, we all see what's happening, and we're here for you. The support in his words filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. She thanked him, and as she left his classroom, she felt her determination solidify. She had people on her side, and that made all the difference. On Friday, Layla sensed that something was different. Phelps's usual tension seemed to have escalated. He appeared at almost every corner, watching her with a hawk-like intensity. She kept her expression neutral, refusing to let him see that his actions bothered her. But just as she was heading toward the exit after her last class, he intercepted her, stepping directly into her path. His face was set, his expression unreadable. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice sharp. "I need to have a word." Layla paused, meeting his gaze with quiet strength. "Yes, Officer Phelps?" He crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "I don't appreciate the way you've been acting around here. You're drawing attention, stirring up trouble." Layla felt a flicker of anger, but forced herself to stay calm. "With all due respect, officer, I haven't done anything to cause trouble. I'm just here to attend my classes and go home." His face darkened, and he took a step closer, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "Don't play innocent with me, Miss Carter. You're not as clever as you think." The hallway had grown silent, a few students watching with bated breath. Layla took a deep breath, her heart pounding, but she held her ground, her voice steady and controlled. "Officer Phelps, I don't understand why I'm being treated differently," she said. "I've been respectful, and I haven't broken any rules. I just want to be able to go to school in peace." The words hung heavily in the air, and for a moment, Phelps looked almost taken aback by her response. But his expression quickly hardened, and he opened his mouth to speak, only to be interrupted by a familiar voice. "Is there a problem here?" Principal Avery approached, her gaze calm but firm as she looked between Layla and Phelps. The tension in the air seemed to deflate slightly at her presence, and Phelps straightened, his face flushing. "No problem, Principal Avery," he replied, his tone stiff. Principal Avery's gaze lingered on him, a quiet authority in her eyes. She turned to Layla, giving her a nod. "Layla, you're free to go. Have a good afternoon." Layla gave her a grateful smile, feeling a surge of relief. As she walked past Phelps, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of victory. She had held her ground, refusing to let him intimidate her, and Principal Avery's intervention had given her the support she needed. As she left the building, her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but in that moment, she felt stronger than ever. The quiet strength she had cultivated within herself had carried her through, and no matter what came next, she knew she was ready to face it. That evening, as Layla sat in her room, she thought back on the day's events. The confrontation with Phelps had left her shaken, but the support from Principal Avery and her friends reminded her that she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by people who saw her strength, who believed in her resilience. She glanced at the small note from her father that she'd taped to her mirror. "Stay strong, Layla. I'm proud of you." The words filled her with a sense of purpose, a reminder that she was fighting for her own dignity and respect. Taking a deep breath, she looked at herself in the mirror, her reflection calm and determined. She wasn't just a student facing unfair scrutiny. She was a young woman finding her voice, learning to stand tall in the face of injustice. And she knew, deep down, that she would continue to hold her head high, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The next Monday morning, Washington High seemed almost quieter than usual. It was as if the entire school had absorbed the tension between Layla and Officer Phelps. Students were whispering in hushed voices, casting occasional glances at Layla as she walked through the hallways. Even Mariah and Jason seemed more alert, their eyes darting around as they walked with her to class. It was as though they sensed that something had shifted in Phelps's demeanor. His gaze, usually piercing, seemed to burn even more intensely whenever he caught sight of her. In her English class, Layla tried to focus, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that followed her. She glanced around, noticing that a few other students looked tense, exchanging worried glances. It was as if they, too, were bracing for something to happen. She didn't know what the rest of the day would bring, but she was determined to keep her head high, no matter what. During lunch, Mariah and Jason sat with Layla at their usual table, offering her small gestures of comfort. Jason gave her a reassuring smile, while Mariah placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "You know, whatever happens, we've got your back," Mariah said quietly. "If he tries anything, we'll be right there with you." Jason nodded in agreement. We're not letting you face this alone. You've handled everything with so much grace, but if you need us to step in, we're here." Layla's heart swelled with gratitude. Her friend's unwavering support had been a lifeline through these challenging weeks, grounding her in moments when she felt overwhelmed. "Thank you, both of you," she replied, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "I don't know what I would have done without you." They shared a quiet, understanding look, and Layla felt a renewed sense of strength settle over her. No matter what Phelps tried, she wasn't going to let him shake her. By the time her last class ended, Layla was ready to go home and leave the tension of the day behind. She gathered her things, intent on heading straight out of the building, but as she stepped into the hallway, she saw Phelps waiting by the main exit. Layla felt a surge of gratitude for her friends. The challenges she'd faced had brought them even closer, and she knew that their support had been invaluable. She was grateful to have friends who had not only stood by her side, but had believed in her every step of the way. One morning in history class, Mr. Walsh paused mid-lesson and addressed the class with a thoughtful look on his face. "Today's history topic might be about events long past, but I want you all to remember that the values we learn about, the courage, the resilience of people who stood up for what's right, are values we can embody ourselves." He glanced at Layla, a subtle but warm acknowledgement in his eyes. Sometimes, showing strength in the face of adversity is the most powerful statement we can make. Layla felt her cheeks flush slightly, but the pride she felt outweighed her embarrassment. Mr. Walsh's words resonated deeply with her, reinforcing her belief that her actions had held meaning beyond her personal experience. She had not only stood up for herself, but she had also reminded those around her of the importance of respect and integrity. After class, a few classmates approached her, offering kind words of encouragement and admiration. Sarah, the classmate who had shown her quiet support earlier, gave her a small smile. "You're a reminder to all of us, Layla. Thank you for being brave," she said softly. Layla smiled back, feeling a sense of fulfillment. She had faced a difficult journey, but hearing that her actions had made a difference in others' lives gave her a profound sense of purpose. One evening, as Layla sat by her bedroom window, she allowed herself to reflect on everything that had happened. The challenges with Officer Phelps had been some of the hardest moments she'd ever faced, but she had come through it stronger. She had learned that standing up for herself didn't make her difficult or defiant. It made her resilient. Thinking back on her father's advice, she felt a renewed sense of gratitude. Captain Carter's words had guided her, reminding her of her inner strength when things had seemed toughest. He had taught her to stay calm, to act with respect, and to rely on her dignity as her greatest asset. She glanced at her reflection in the window, her expression calm and self-assured. She wasn't just the same Layla who had started this journey. She was someone who had faced adversity with courage and grace, someone who knew her own worth. The next morning, Layla walked through Washington High's hallways with a confidence that surprised even herself. The looks she received from her classmates and teachers weren't just of curiosity or concern anymore. They were looks of respect. During lunch, she joined Mariah and Jason at their table, where they were already engaged in a lively conversation. Mariah grinned at her, her eyes twinkling with pride. "Look at you, Layla," she said. "You're like a whole new person." Layla chuckled, feeling the truth of her friend's words. "I guess I just feel different. Stronger." Jason nodded. "You are stronger. And no matter what, you know you have people here who've got your back." Layla's heart swelled with gratitude. She knew that her friendships and the support of her school community had been essential in helping her face the challenges with Phelps. She was no longer just a student dealing with unfair treatment. She was someone who had earned the respect of those around her. As the semester progressed, Layla threw herself into her studies with renewed focus and determination. The experiences she had faced had helped her see her future with clarity, and she was more committed than ever to pursuing her dreams. One afternoon, she joined her father at the kitchen table to discuss her college plans. Captain Carter listened with a proud smile as she shared her goals, offering his own insights and encouragement. "I think you'll make an incredible difference wherever you go, Layla," he said. "You've already shown what you're capable of." Layla felt a surge of pride as she nodded, her father's belief in her fueling her ambition. She knew that, whatever path she chose, She would carry the lessons she'd learned with her. With the end of the school year approaching, Layla felt a bittersweet sense of closure. The memories of her journey, both the hardships and the victories, would remain with her, but she was ready to move forward. On the last day of school, Mariah, Jason, and a few other friends gathered with her in the courtyard, sharing stories and laughter as they reflected on the year. They celebrated not only their achievements, but also the strength they had all found together. As the final bell rang, signaling the start of summer, Layla looked around at her friends, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. She knew that the challenges she had faced had brought them closer, solidifying bonds that would last far beyond high school. As she walked out of Washington High for the last time that year, she held her head high, her heart filled with hope for the future. In the months that followed, Layla continued to carry the strength she had discovered within herself. She pursued her goals with determination, guided by the knowledge that she had the resilience to face any challenge. The experiences with Officer Phelps had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, but she had emerged from it all with a newfound sense of purpose. She knew that she would face challenges in the future, but she would always remember the strength she had found at Washington High and the people who had stood by her side. As she looked ahead to the next chapter of her life, Layla felt a sense of calm and confidence. She was ready to step into the world, armed with the courage, resilience, and dignity that had carried her through her journey. And no matter what lay ahead, she knew she would face it with the same quiet strength that had seen her through before. If you enjoyed following Layla's journey, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring story. By subscribing, you're helping us bring more uplifting stories about resilience, courage, and personal growth straight to your feed. Thank you for being part of our community, and we can't wait to see you in the next story.